Hassan.
I was kind of trying to tie up the two presentations. This is for Guido. Could you do something, if you're interested in how ancient Near Eastern folks look like, couldn't you do what Uri did and kind of go to literary sources? I was wondering whether there are any literary or myths. We had actually a conference on the use of literature as a source for legal history. So obviously in the Greek case, we can do it, get some, with all the caveats, get some idea of how actual tribes look like. So I'm wondering whether your sources, there's also a possibility.
This is one of the main disadvantages, because we don't have any theoretical reflection on law like we have in Greece with all the philosophers. So you could say the ancient Near East has got the technique. Greece has got the philosophy, and the Romans made it up to science. So that's the common narrative. But and of course, there is literature, Epos of Gilgamesh, and there are other literary texts, hymns, and so on. But they give us some information on the understanding of justice, for example. As I said, these consecration inscriptions, for example, and information about social reforms, but not. There's no information about the technical aspects of law and legal decision making.
So mine is actually in some ways connected to the literary sources, but is from Uri. So Uri, you seem to focus your discussion on this tension between strict reading of the legal text and the reading that is open to the judge's discretion.
Mm-hmm.
And in my ears, but it may be only in my ears, this sounds like a very contemporary discussion, almost too contemporary to quite capture it. Again, I'm asking the sensitivities of the Greeks, because the question of the certainty of the law is very much the problem of the modern state. And so the question is whether, when we turn to, for example, to the idea of the agophos nomos, to the unwritten law, whether what we're talking about is discretion at all. Is that, or is it simply a different law, and not simply, do whatever, you said, the judge should decide to in his own view, like a subjective decision. And what I have in mind very briefly is Antigone, who uses this agophos nomos in her response to Zeus, and she appeals to this nomos agophos. And I don't think what she's meaning is, okay, I heard what you have to say, and now I'll do what I want. What I think is, my discretion, what I think should be. But clearly she's appealing to some kind of law, unclear what exactly this law is, and it's not discretion.
Well, in the interpretation of agophos nomos, there are different views, and it's not generally agreed that it is always that it always means the same thing. For example, in the case of Antigone, it means basically common moral values. She wants to bury her brother, and she's prevented from doing it, and she goes back to the agophos nomos, which means actually the general, almost universal notion that family members has to bury other family, that brothers have to bury each other. So I would say that agophos nomos would be, let's say, general, almost universal, or at least pan-Hellenic notions that are applied anywhere. Okay, without ever being written. For example, there is never in any written law, as far as I know, on incest, on the fact that you should not marry your mother, or a father should not marry his daughter. But this is because it goes without saying, so I would assume that in the case of Antigone, this is what agophos nomos means. However, as you can read in my handout, I just gave here two different translations to the Agraphos Nomos in the context of Andokides. One is that it is not written, as we said, in the case of Antigone, but the other, which is actually the more commonly accepted, is that it is simply something that was not ratified by the commission who actually issued this, this system. So it's actually written, but not ratified. So in this case, Agraphos would mean something quite different. Now I put both interpretations, both translations, because I'm not sure about what it means in this case.
But none of those are discretion.
No, none of those are discretion. You're right, of course.
Just to add another opinion, a few weeks ago we had Markus Asper from Berlin and Frankfurt. This is a philologist as well, and he claimed that the distinction between written and unwritten law might be seen as the beginning of a normative order, because different levels are brought into an order, into a hierarchy, and everything which was happening before is not a normative order as such. The law sources, the legal sources are not a normative order as such, but the mere reflection of something that lies behind. And the interesting question is what lies behind, and mostly it's behind the sources. So.
Yes, this is exactly what I said. I mean, this, you have to wait until 403 BC until you get not 4000, which is your period. I'm sorry, which is actually to get the laws conceptualized, the sources of the laws conceptualized. So this is where you say you have Agraphos Nomos. This is where you have the differentiation by the organs who actually issued these laws or this decree. And this is where you have for the first time also the most just dike or dikaiotate gnome as a concept which actually should be taken into consideration. So this is actually part of the same wave, the same almost burst of conceptualization of the law. So, okay. Yes.
Some slight linguistic comments. Dayan is also the term that is used in the Babylonian Talmud for a judge, Dayana, and it continued to be used in Jewish law until today. The judges of the rabbinical court are called Dayanim. So it is still existing today. Also, Beisharim, which you quote, it is from Psalm, Shpot tevel betzedek v'amin b'meisharim. God would judge the universe in a just way, and the nations in Beisharim. So you have the use of this term in the context.
Any other questions?
Oh, maybe another question, but kind of. Maybe I'm continuing with what is next. I was wondering kind of about the hierarchy between unwritten and written law, because in the Jewish law it's actually kind of the written law comes before the oral versus the written kind of mixes up in a sense. So it's not as if oral tradition precedes written law. It's actually, I was wondering whether there's any culture of orality. Because we have an unwritten Jewish law, unwritten the oral Torah is actually later than the written.
But if you assume that unwritten law are the norms that actually existed before writing was introduced into the Greek world, it must at least chronologically precede.
But if you look at the technology of writing comes after.
Exactly.
But in Jewish law, for some reason,
According to the formal story.
yeah, I don't know why.
Yeah, but it's
It's
very deep.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Because legal system cannot acknowledge the fact that written law has priority to written
But
law.
in-
Unwritten law has
But
priority
in terms
to.
of the certainty question, I think it actually, the Asaf's point proves how in some cultures it works the other way around. The written law is actually totally indeterminate. It's open. The oral law is actually what gives the written law a much larger level of certainty and concreteness. And so this is why I think, so I'm not sure about the Greek world, but clearly there's a question, an open question here about the relationship, especially with respect to the question of certainty.
I think this is closely related to an aspect you mentioned in the context of the definition of law, because it's not the question state, non-state, but the question is, where does the liability of law come from? Where is it derived from? And that's a question of authority or power, and that's not necessarily the state who represents the power, but authority can also be derived from a text, from a school, from persons, from thoughts, from community. So this is a rather diverse field. Yeah.
Go ahead. To complicate things further, I would like to introduce another distinction, which is sometimes set in parallel to written versus unwritten law, and that is lex versus consuetudo, so customs versus against law. And some scholars in Germany have argued against this juxtaposition by saying customs, as opposed to law, can only appear when the process of writing law down has started. So customary law has a parallel role, complementary role in the world of learned law, whereas before the arrival of learned, studied, written law, all law has this non-written character and everything that comes with it. So the notion of customary is really useless and insignificant previous to the process of writing things down. So, how is the discussion in your respective legal orders in regard to customary law? Is it discussed?
It's not discussed. It's as I said, it's agreed as a background to fill and to explain the lacunas in the law codes, for example, to make up a basement, a fundament of customary law. I once tried to import the term of Rechtsgewohnheiten, which turns it the other way round, which I think is more adequate. But there's no discussion in the sense of the word.
And it's hard to translate.
Yeah, it's very hard. Yeah.
By the way, in the Bible, you find the same type of rules.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, the rule of divorcing a wife.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing
Mm-hmm.
mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to assume that there was some customary law in the background that supplements the written law.
Yeah.
And the written law emphasizes some.
No, the written law supplements the unwritten law.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
By the way, English law was the same.
Yeah.
The common law and the statutory law. The statutory law usually only fill some gaps that were, at least in the 20th century.
Yeah.
So what you describe here in the ancient law, it is quite similar to what we find in the Bible.
Yeah.
In the law.
Yeah. And I think the main aspect we could compare is the scholarly context. And we don't find this explicitly in our records, but we can assume that this is the main realm, the main point where this happens. So.
Did you want to comment?
I want to, but I think it would be rude to intervene without having listened to the papers. So the basic comment about orality, literacy, and custom and law. And I think we're turning in circles for some 100 years or so.
To explain.
In the discussion of literacy and orality, we had the same problem, basically, that Albrecht had raised. And I think it can be easily solved if we recognize that we have to make distinctions. And the distinction is between orality as encompassing state and oral versus written within complex systems. And this I understand in the sense of using customary law to supplement, to develop written. But then many of our sources and many of our constitutive myths do not make this distinction between orality as the situation of humanity before writing enters the stage, and whatever we associate with orality in societies which already know writing. And the differences are enormous, but for rhetorical reasons, they are very often mixed and used one to supplement the other. And the same I say with custom. Surely system of mores would be there in any given society without written law. But to speak about customary law, you have to have written law. And if we make this conceptual distinction, I think we can live more peacefully and pose our question more sharply. Because when we discuss Rechtsgewohnheit and customary law, we are surely speaking about places where things have already been statuted, are already there to be commented upon. But users would very often enhance the authority of customary law by appealing to the state that is presumed to have existed before, where you only had custom as an encompassing system. And we might be playing into their tricks. So.
There is a actually very interesting text that I did not. May I?
Of course.
There is a very familiar, famous inscription, which is actually records the law of Draco on unpremeditated murder. And the law starts with that even in the case of unpremeditated murder, the person who committed the manslaughter should go in exile. And there was a long debate of what even Kai means in this case, and the interpretation I gave my student, because it was didactically very, very convenient to give, not because I'm certainly certain about it, was that it was in a way trying to get into the system of unwritten law, a written concept, because the pronoia, the premeditation, was relatively new concept, and it has to be put into writing. But in that case, it did not actually form a new law about the entire concept of manslaughter, but actually tried to supplement the unwritten law, or whatever you might want to call it here, through writing. Okay, so in that case, this is why I said what I said earlier. So in the very earliest, and this is the 7th century BC, so in the very earliest stages, the concept is not the supplement, that Gewohnheitsrechts or whatever actually is added to the written law, rather that, you know. So.
Rachel, did you want to ask a question?
He knows better than me, but the question is if we can really speak about legal pluralism for antiquity. I was wondering that, and the second, if we can distinguish for the past between legal sources and juridical sources.
What is legal pluralism? No,
That's what I mean.
So if you could explain to me what legal pluralism is, so I can.
No, I can't do it. So
I think it depends on the period and the region. If we take a look at Hellenistic and Roman Egypt, I would immediately say yes, this is legal pluralism at its best, because we have that what Lena defined as several legal orders in the framework of one political entity. Yeah. When it comes to the ancient Near East, I'm rather skeptical because of the few features we have to have law as such in the contour of law, and they seem to be rather stable across millennia.
So William Twining has a good article about legal pluralism and normative pluralism, in which one of the things he does is he assigns his students the task of writing down every legal system or normative order, if you want to call it that they encounter over a 24-hour basis. And he says the lazy ones come up with less than 100. So that if you actually are attentive to it, there's always legal pluralism. The only question is, what does it look like, not if it exists or not, as far as I'm concerned, even historically. Ingrid, did you have a question?
I just wanted to make a small remark, and it's something that I learned when I did contracts, and that was that one of my professors told me that he didn't believe in the necessity of doing contracts in a written down way, because if a contract is not obliged by both parties, then you don't need to write it down. It will not be enforced in any way better. The only reason why you would do it is, for once, which was a personal remark, in order to prove who's the bad guy. And the second one was to prove to anyone for other purposes that this contract existed. So I was wondering whether we might include this thought also when we're thinking about writing down norms, whether that's really not something meant for the present, but rather for the future, which would connect to what we were talking about earlier, that maybe the starting point of a new normative order is not that it's been written down, but that whoever wrote it down intended to make it a permanent regulation, rather than leaving it to oral transport, which always has the inclusion of someone changing the story when telling it, or just forgetting something, etc. And so maybe it's much more profane.
Great. Let's thank our speakers.